on there. Now, thank you again for joining us this evening for Anatomy of a Duel, Secession, Civil War, and the Evolution of Kentucky Violence. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd like to remind all of us joining in person to please silence your cell phones for the duration of the program, as I'll do right now. And then additionally, sorry about that. We'll have a short question and answer program following Stuart's lecture. Stuart will go 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And I'll get up and moderate it. We'll have a mic, and we'll need you to use the mic so that the people who are Zooming in, and there are quite a few of them this evening, can hear the questions and Stuart's responses as well. Also, if you're joining us virtually, just put your questions into the chat room and we'll read them as time permits as well. And then anybody with a hearing issue, if you can just let us know, someone on our staff can get you the hearing thing. Because yeah, I know my wife says that, I'm losing my ability frequently to articulate as I age. Yeah, no. Anyhow, moving on, Stuart Sanders, our lecturer for tonight, is a very, very, very good friend of the professionals on the Filson staff. There's a great deal of interaction back and forth between Stuart at Kentucky Historical Society and the professionals on our staff, and we think very, very highly of him. He's a graduate of Center College and is now the Director of Research and Publications for the Kentucky Historical Society. He's the former Executive Director of the Perryville Battlefield Preservation Association. He's the author of 5 books, including Perryville Under Fire, the aftermath of Kentucky's largest Civil War battle, the Battle of Mill Springs, Kentucky, Maney's Confederate Brigade at the Battle of Perryville, Murder on the Ohio Bell, and then tonight's discussion, Anatomy of a Duel, Secession, Civil War, and the Evolution of Kentucky Violence. All of these collectively place Stuart among the very top Kentucky historians currently toiling in the vineyards of Kentucky history and among that same pantheon the whole time. So welcome, and please join me in welcoming Stuart.
Well, thank you all so much for having me here today. And as Stig mentioned, I'll be speaking on my new book, Anatomy of a Duel. And actually, a lot of the research that I did for this book was done here at the Filson. So I'm a huge fan of the entire staff, but notably the archivists and librarians who do so much great work here. I also had a distant cousin who recently attended a Filson tour, I think related to George Rogers Clark and the Revolutionary War, as a bus tour. And she went on and on and on about it. So I know the programs here are wonderful as well. So on May 6th, 1862, there's a Union colonel named Leonidas Metcalfe, who's pictured here on your right, who left a hotel in Maysville, Kentucky, after attending a political meeting. And Metcalfe was the son of a Kentucky governor, Thomas Stonehammer Metcalfe, and he was an early advocate for the Union cause in Kentucky. He'd enlisted in the Union Army early on and raised troops, and was an early fighter for Unionism in Kentucky. And as he left this hotel in Maysville, a local resident named Isaac Nelson seemingly appeared out of nowhere and handed Metcalfe a note. And it read, "Sir, Having done me a great wrong under circumstances accompanying indignity with outrage, you cannot refuse that which is the object of this note to demand the satisfaction due from one gentleman to another. My friend, Mr. Isaac Nelson, is authorized to arrange the terms of our meeting, and it was signed William T. Casto. Now, Metcalfe did not recognize the name William T. Casto, but he would remember him for the rest of his life, because just a few days after this note was handed off, the two men would duel outside of Maysville using Colt revolving rifles standing just 60 yards apart. So how did this duel come about? And why, when the Civil War was raging, did these two men, one a Union colonel, the other a pro-Confederate civilian, why did they sort of fight their own battle on a dueling ground? And the answer really lies in the arrests of the wartime arrests of secessionist civilians in Kentucky. And in September of 1861, Union authorities in Kentucky were really trying to find a way to consolidate their power across the state. And they did this by, one way was arresting pro-Confederate civilians. And in addition to arresting newspaper editors, telegraph operators, some more middling politicians, Union authorities really worked to quell secessionist sympathies in the bluegrass state by seizing prominent citizens and then shipping them off to northern prisons. And in most instances during this period, this was more like sort of a modern scared straight program is probably a good way to put it. Union authorities really arrested these men to try to sort of terrify them into compliance, essentially. They were sent to places like Camp Chase in Ohio, or Fort Warren in Boston Harbor, or Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor, which is pictured here. Union authorities at the time really had no intention of keeping the men. Again, they were sort of trying to scare the Confederate out of them, so to speak. They were typically held for several months in miserable conditions, sleeping on, dirty straw on the floor, eating terrible food. They really wanted to sort of scare these men that they would spend the remainder of the Civil War in these conditions, and they would sort of ask them or tell them they could get their freedom if they simply took a Union oath of allegiance. They would be let go, and that's typically what happened. Even though it tended to be more obscure people who were arrested by Union authorities, there were some instances where more prominent Kentuckians sort of fell into their hands. Pictured here, for example, is James B. Clay, who's the son of Henry Clay, and he was nabbed by Union authorities in eastern Kentucky with a couple of revolvers strapped under his coat and a Bowie knife, as he was supposedly on his way to join the Confederate Army down in eastern Kentucky and in Virginia. Unionists were sort of so excited to have grabbed him because he was sort of the first big name. He was a Confederate to fall into their hands. However, he was first sent to Lexington in chains to sort of show local residents, if we can grab the son of Henry Clay, we can nab anyone. He was then sent to Camp Dick Robinson, a Union recruiting ground in Garrett County, where he was roughed up a little bit. But he eventually found his way to here in Louisville, where before Union authorities could take him across the Ohio River to send him to a Union prison, a judge issued a writ of habeas corpus and let James B. Clay bail out for $10,000. So he paid his bail and was released, to the chagrin of many people at that point. So they tended to grab more prominent people, but there's actually a Filson connection to these arrests. When one night in Louisville, a number of prominent Kentuckians were arrested, included former Kentucky Governor Charles Slaughter Moorhead, who was accused of sort of uttering secessionist sympathies. But among the men arrested with Moorhead was Reuben Durrett, who some of you may know as one of the founders of the Filson Club at the time. And at the time, Durrett was editor of the Louisville Courier newspaper, and he was seized for publishing secessionist articles and for publishing secessionist editorials mainly. And people had previously complained to the Lincoln administration about Durrett and about what he was writing. One Hoosier actually wrote, quote, "The people are getting tired of sending their sons to fight the rebels, while people such as this editor, more mischievous by far than if armed with muskets, are allowed to furnish aid and comfort to the enemy unmolested." And so he said that, a man like this should be put in a place like Fort Lafayette. And that's indeed what happened. Durrett was seized, and he was locked up in Fort Lafayette, New York Harbor, for his secessionist sympathies. And News of his arrest actually excited a number of Unionists in Kentucky, including Joseph Holt, who became Lincoln's Judge Advocate General. And Holt actually wrote that, quote, "His arrest has rejoiced the hearts of the Union men in Kentucky." So people were pleased that this newspaper editor had gotten seized. Well, upon his arrest, Durrett's wife supposedly had a nervous breakdown. And there are a number of letters that talk about this. She was so upset about him being seized that a number of prominent Unionists in Kentucky began writing the Lincoln administration, urging that Durrett be freed. This include his arch enemy and rival, George Prentice, who was editor of the Louisville Journal. And Prentice and Durrett had tangled in their respective newspapers, but finally, it spilled off the page, and the two men actually engaged in a shootout in downtown Lexington in 1857. They had a fight in front of an attorney's office. Prentice stood in the street. Durrett stood in a doorway with his arm swinging around the door and actually shot Prentice in the leg. More unfortunate, though, was the poor attorney who owned the office, who was wounded in this fray. And so despite this, and despite the fact that Prentice and Durrett despised one another, Prentice actually caused for Durrett to be released. And he actually wrote a pretty funny letter to Lincoln, and he said, "Mr. Durrett has been, and I presume still is, a bitter personal enemy of mine, but I'm extremely anxious for his release. He is a secessionist, but he's never done any harm in our community. He couldn't do any harm if he would. He is not without talent, but he has no influence, and his discharge could not be productive of the least possible injury to the Union cause. But the strongest reason why I wish his release is that his wife, a most estimable woman, is on the verge of delirium on his account. I do believe in my heart that if he be kept from her many more days, she will go utterly and hopelessly mad." And so eventually this reached the right ears, and Durrett was allowed to take the Union oath of allegiance, and he was released after spending several months in a Union prison. As you know, he founded the Filson after the war, became an attorney, and actually helped bring natural gas to Louisville, of all things, and sort of expanded natural gas here. Was on the board of several charitable donations. And by the time he died in 1913, he was called one of the most learned men in Louisville. So Durrett was among, these pro-secessionist Kentuckians who were seized up in these arrests. And, Union Colonel Leonidas Metcalfe, who ultimately dueled William Casto near Maysville, took part in these arrests. And the root of the duel sort of lies in these arrests. And so on October 2nd, 1861, Union General Bull Nelson, who's pictured here, ordered Metcalfe to arrest 7 Maysville secessionists, including William T. Casto. And Nelson essentially did this in order to protect his rear flank as he sent troops from Maysville down into eastern Kentucky to drive rebel troops out of that region. So why did he arrest Casto? Now, Casto was the son of a well-to-do grocer. He had actually been mayor of Maysville for a while, but by the time the Civil War rolled around, he was sort of seen as a ne'er-do-well attorney. And it was one local wag said that he spent too much time at the bar of a local tavern as opposed to spending it at the legal bar, which I think is a great quote about him. But, he was seen as being a well-known secessionist in Maysville. He'd argued with Bull Nelson on one occasion and had essentially put a target on his back. So on this night in October 1861, Metcalfe arrested William T. Casto and a number of other men, including a former U.S. congressman named Richard Stanton. And so all of the men were eventually imprisoned at Fort Warren in Boston Harbor or Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor. And again, Union authorities had no intention of keeping these men. Again, they just wanted them to sort of suffer for a few months, get scared enough, then take the Union loyalty oath, and then be set free. And after sitting in these dank prison cells for several months, most of the Maysville men ended up taking the Union loyalty oath and were released. However, not Casto. Instead, he sort of sat ruminating about revenge. He was writing letters saying, "I'm an attorney. My constitutional rights have been violated. I'm guilty of no crime. I want a trial." And this sort of correspondence between him and Union authorities went on and on for weeks. And he refused to take the oath because he said he did nothing wrong. He had no reason to do it. But finally, his refusal to take the oath frustrated Union authorities so much they essentially kicked him out of the prison and just sent him back home to Maysville. So his complaining had done some good in this instance, and finally they released him. And as soon as he returned to Maysville, he began practicing with rifles and pistols and preparing himself for a duel. And he wanted to take revenge on the first person he encountered who was involved in his arrest and in his humiliation. And that ended up being Union Colonel Leonidas Metcalfe, who happened to be in Maysville. Now, since Metcalfe was upper class, since he was the son of a Kentucky governor, Casto would not simply walk up to Metcalfe and shoot him on the street and murder him. Instead, he would challenge him to a duel, and that's exactly what he did. And when Metcalfe got this challenge from Casto's friend, he, again, had no memory of arresting Casto specifically, but since he'd made a name for himself as a strong Unionist, he said later he did not want to be browbeaten, and he was afraid that if he refused this call to duel, that other pro-Confederate Kentuckians would keep challenging him to a duel as a way to try to kill him and take him out of Union service or sort of shame him to the point where he would leave the service. So the Casto-Metcalfe duel really played into Kentucky's own brand of honor culture. And you've all heard, about Southern honor. And most duels had their root in this sort of code of honor. And just to really simplify it, the honor code were unwritten rules of behavior that really regulated how you acted, but also how society viewed you. And that was more important because above all, those who followed this code of honor wanted to avoid shame. So if someone insulted you or, had a failed business deal with you that might bring you some sort of shame, one recourse, if you were both upper class Kentuckians, was to sort of send a challenge to duel and fight on the dueling ground in order to protect your reputation. Otherwise, if you were insulted, Jim Pritchard called me a poltroon and a coward. If we refused to duel, society would view us as being a coward potentially. And so it's really hard to understand how this sort of pushed people to the dueling ground, how important it was to sort of maintain your reputation at that time and avoid shame. But that's what ended up getting people to the dueling ground. And as we know, multiple prominent Kentuckians from Henry Clay, Cassius Marcellus Clay, and many, many more ended up fighting duels in order to maintain their reputations. Of course, fighting a duel sort of outweighed any sort of legal consequences that one may face. It was, laws against dueling appeared in Kentucky as early as 1799. Anyone who was convicted of issuing a challenge to duel or actually fighting a duel was, banned from holding any state office. Moreover, all public officials, attorneys, the Secretary of State and more, had to have to hold their hand up and swear. And this is still on the books. If there are any lawyers in the audience, I've never fought a duel nor acted as a second. Raise your hand if you've taken that oath. There are a few people here who have. It's still on the books. It usually gets a chuckle. I work for the Kentucky Historical Society. Our board members have to take that, and people laugh. But it was, it was instituted as a way to sort of try to deter upper class Kentuckians from dueling, because they believed that sort of political ambition might sort of outweigh a man's desire to duel, and that's why that oath was put in. And the oath actually became part of the Kentucky Constitution in 1849, 1850, and again, it remains there today. But as we know, the laws in fear of legal consequences really did little to prevent upper class Kentuckians from dueling. And when, again, men like Henry Clay were fighting, it sort of put a societal stamp of approval on the practice. Mainly because courts rarely prosecuted duelists as well. So it essentially became sort of a regulated, community-sanctioned form of violent conflict resolution, unfortunately. So again, I mentioned a number of prominent Kentuckians dueled, and this included, Henry Clay. For example, in 1807, Clay was in the state legislature, and another legislator named Humphrey Marshall. They had an argument, he and Marshall did. Clay was, tensions were high with Great Britain. This was a few years before the War of 1812. And Clay had issued a resolution saying that Kentuckians should only wear clothing of domestic manufacture. And Humphrey Marshall basically called this idea the claptrap of a demagogue. It's a great line. And I wish politicians today would use more flowery language like this, but alas, it's not to be. But Clay was insulted by this and challenged Marshall, and the duel was fought actually near Louisville, I think across the Ohio River. with pistols. Both men missed twice, but on the third fire, Marshall actually shot Clay in the leg, giving Clay a minor wound. This was not Clay's only duel. About 20 years later, when he was Secretary of State, he actually fought a duel with a U.S. Senator named John Randolph, because Randolph had called him the cross between the Puritan and the black leg. Clutch my pearls, insult. But they ended up dueling outside of Washington, D.C. Using pistols. Both men missed on the first volley. On the second volley, Clay fired and missed. And Randolph, seeing himself as the honorable Virginian, simply fired his pistol in the air. Clay was, overwhelmed by this gesture, and the two men shook hands, reconciled, and eventually became friends. Of course, Clay, as we know, became known as the Great Compromiser, which I find very ironic considering he fought several duels during his lifetime. But that is his nickname. There were also famous dueling grounds in Kentucky and Lexington. There was a farm the farm of James K. Duke, which is located now where the Kentucky Horse Park is. It's on the Scott County-Fayette County line. There are numbers of duels that were fought there, including one quite grisly one in 1852 when two students from Transylvania University dueled using shotguns loaded with slugs at 40 yards. And one student actually blew the head off of the other one. So, these duels could be interesting, Randolph shooting in the air, little blood was drawn, but, there were more sinister times and more sad times when Kentuckians were killed fighting these affairs of honor. So at the time, again, the Civil War was raging. Just a month before Casto and Metcalfe ended up dueling, more than 23,000 Union and Confederate soldiers were killed during the Battle of Shiloh. So why, when all this bloodshed was happening, did these two men end up fighting this duel? Mainly because Casto believed that his honor had been impugned and that he'd been shamed when he was hauled off to a Union prison. And in order to cleanse his honor and sort of cleanse that personal shame, and also to get revenge, I think, on the men who had locked him away, he ended up challenging Metcalfe to that duel. Again, the Civil War was raging. And again, it seems strange to think of two men fighting a formal structured duel involving negotiations while this massive conflict is being fought across the United States. But there were other duels between soldiers during the conflict. Pictured here is Brigadier General George Earl Manny, who led a brigade at the Battle of Perryville. As Dick mentioned, a book I wrote is about Manny's brigade at Perryville. Many of his regiments suffered more than 50% casualties in the fight at Perryville, which, if you study Civil War battles, that's a huge number. I mean, they endured some of the heaviest fighting of the day. And after that battle, there were accounts that, or accusations rather, that Manny had acted in a cowardly fashion in the battle. And what had actually happened, he sort of stayed more to the rear because he'd been thrown off his horse and kicked in the head by his horse and could not advance with his troops. And when people didn't see Manny advancing, rumors started swirling that he had avoided the fight. And there was a doctor in Nashville named George Nickel who ended up accusing Manny of cowardice after the Battle of Perryville. Of course, this infuriated Manny, who was also from Nashville, and the two men fought a duel. And while details are pretty scant about this particular fight, it was said that Manny ended up wounding the doctor and sort of saving his reputation at that time. In another duel, John Marmaduke and, pictured here, and ended up fighting Lucius Walker, who's another Confederate general. They fought a duel near Little Rock, Arkansas in 1863 after Marmaduke had inferred that Walker was a coward. Tension between the two men had existed really for months at this point. There have been claims in certain battles that, one general's regiments had not supported the other general, and they argued, and this continued on until they, settled their differences in this violent way in 1863 on the dueling ground. And they fought with 6-shot Colt Navy revolvers at about 15 paces, so basically 45 feet. And in the fight, Marmaduke killed Walker. And even though Marmaduke was charged with murder, the charges were eventually dropped because there was a war to fight after all. And most of these high-ranking Confederates sort of, again, saw dueling as a necessary thing in order to maintain one's reputation. So it was that concept of honor that really drove them to the field. And these duels really called for, the code of honor really called for duels to be kept dispassionate. You weren't supposed to be angry on the battlefield. It was a very formal, regulated structured affair. And emotion was essentially kept out of the equation. So this is how duels typically work. So if your honor had been maligned, you would have your second, your trusted friend, basically who would act as an intermediary and a negotiator. That second would give a note saying, Jim, I challenge you to a duel, which I don't want to do because I'm afraid he'll actually hurt me. But what happens is with the dueling, after the note happened, there'd be a negotiation about the weapons that would be used, the time and place of the duel. And it was typical in Kentucky that the challenged party would get to choose the weapons. So if Jim challenged me to a duel, I would say, okay, we're going to do pistols at 10 paces, 30 feet. And so that's the negotiations would sort of go on until people were satisfied with how the dueling would happen. However, sometimes negotiations broke down because of the weapons that were chosen. As I mentioned, the challenge party got to choose the time and place of the duel and those weapons. And again, in Kentucky, pistols at 30 feet was typical. Rifles were also used, but knives and swords were chosen on occasion too. And it may surprise you that Honest Abe actually got himself embroiled in a affair of honor. When he lived in Illinois, he started writing some newspaper letters that disparaged the Illinois state auditor. The auditor found out, these were anonymous letters, found out that Lincoln had written them, and this auditor became enraged. He challenged Lincoln to a duel. So the auditor was actually a diminutive man, was quite small, and as we know, Honest Abe had sort of built up his physique, swinging an axe on the Kentucky, Indiana, and Illinois frontiers. So when the challenge was issued, Lincoln chose broadswords as the weapon, and the smaller auditor, wisely demurred and said he didn't want to fight Lincoln. Lincoln later said, that he knew that he would have cut the man in two. So he, did this as part of his negotiating tactic to get out of the duel. Sometimes suicidal terms were picked in order to avoid the fight. I found one account where a challenged man chose double-barreled shotguns at 5 paces with the weapons balanced on a wire, and at the count of 3, they would both pull the trigger, which of course was completely suicidal, seen as crazy, so the duel, of course, fell apart. So sometimes you could get away with sort of bluffing your way out of a duel by picking these crazy circumstances with which to fight. So I wonder, though, Lincoln only got 100 votes in Kentucky or 1,000 votes. I mean, he got 5 votes in Fayette County, which is the home of his in-laws. But you wonder, would he have actually gotten more votes in Kentucky if he'd fought a duel against the auditor? Sadly, he probably would have. But back to Casto and Metcalfe and their duel along the Ohio River in 1862. So on May 8th, 1862, just 2 days after the challenge was issued, Casto and Metcalfe fought their duel on what was called the fishing shore along the Ohio River, just outside of Dover, Kentucky, which is in Mason County near Maysville. And they picked this spot because it was sort of a quiet, out-of-the-way place. Dueling was illegal, so you didn't want to spend a lot of time talking about it. You didn't want any press about it because you faced arrest. Metcalfe, as a Union soldier, also faced the risk of being court-martialed as well, since he was a Union officer. So they tried to keep the duel quiet. However, roughly 200 witnesses showed up, spectators rather, to watch this duel play out on the banks of the Ohio River outside of Dover, Kentucky. Again, Metcalfe accepted the fight because he didn't want to be browbeaten. He knew as a prominent Unionist, he could face other challenges if he didn't fight. As one Dover resident put it, he said, "Mutual friends made an effort to reconcile the political antagonists, but a fight alone could heal the wounded honor of the one and preserve its integrity in the other." So as the challenged party, Metcalfe chose rifles at 60 yards. And Casto's negotiators had initially balked at this idea because Casto was not very familiar with firearms. I mentioned when he got released out of prison, he started practicing with rifles, started practicing with pistols, but he was not a man accustomed to using these deadly weapons. Finally, as they ended up negotiating, Metcalfe was saying, "Look, I'm going to use the Sharps rifle. You can use whatever rifle you want." This is sort of how the negotiation played out. Finally, they ended up choosing Colt revolving rifles, which is loaded with 1 shot, which is pictured here. It's about, I think it's a 56 caliber rifle, and they ended up fighting at about 60 yards. There were other duels used with rifles. There was a fight between 2 members of Congress William Graves of Kentucky, and Silly. Do you remember Silly's first name? Yeah, Jonathan Silly, who's from Maine, I believe. And they fought a duel when they were in Congress. They ended up using rifles, I think at about 80 yards. And Graves ended up killing Silly. And it became a huge scandal because two U.S. congressmen, and it ended up sort of sparking a lot of anti-dueling societies and anti-dueling legislation. So anyway, when they wanted to keep the duel secret, there were about 200 spectators there, and the scene was, fairly jovial. And Casto ended up coming down the Ohio River to the dueling ground. He had a bunch of friends on board a steamboat. They were having a nice time. And as soon as he disembarked on the Ohio River, he immediately began practicing shooting this rifle. And Metcalfe arrives in a carriage with a number of friends. He gets out, and he ends up lying down and taking a nap on the banks of the Ohio River. And while this rifle of Casto practicing is sputtering off in the distance, he sort of looks out of one eye, gets up, rubs the sleep out of his eye, picks up the Colt revolving rifle, and then shoots the handle off a pocket knife that was stuck in a log from 60 yards away. And not a good person to be fighting against. Part of me, I go, it's kind of obvious who won this duel probably after giving that little gem away. But essentially, the two men lined up. As I mentioned, you wanted duels to be fair more than anything. So there were certain rules to the code duello. For example, a younger man would not fight an old man. You would not fight someone who had a mental illness. You wouldn't fight a child. Duels would end after blood was drawn, for example, because if Jim shot me in the arm, I could not continue and the duel would no longer be fair. So sort of first blood would end up ending the duel. So Metcalfe took this very, very seriously. He ended up, they flipped a coin to determine where the men would stand. He won the coin toss, but he ended up standing with the sun facing him, with the sun in his eyes, because that's how confident he was, and he wanted to keep this a fair fight. As the two men lined up, he looked at one of his seconds. He said, "I'm going to shoot him through the left breast pocket." And when the call to fire was given, they would have a 3-second time to shoot. 1, 2, 3. He let Casto shoot first. The bullet whizzed harmlessly by the side of his head, and then he aimed and fired, and he had called his shot. He ended up shooting Casto in the chest. Casto pitched forward like a log, falling on the bank of the Ohio River, and he expired in less than 15 minutes. Now, the trip back up the Ohio River, as his friends took his body back to Maysville for burial, was much more serious. And the men were not jovial, they were not laughing, they were not joking. And that is where Casto ended up being buried. Now, this duel to me is important. Again, Metcalfe won, and he ended up, Metcalfe's a really interesting character because he sort of had a political change during the war. And he was a pro-slavery unionist when he joined the Union service, but he quickly became an antagonist of slavery and slave owners. He was one of the few unionist Kentuckians during the Civil War who really said, slavery is the cause of the war. We need to blame slave owners for this terror that has been brought upon us. And so not a very popular opinion to have in wartime Kentucky. He was eventually sort of driven out of the state and ended up living in Cincinnati, where he died just a few years after the war, sort of a man without a home, essentially. It was those political, he ended up supporting Lincoln, another black mark, and he also supported the enlistment of African-American Union soldiers. So he had 3 strikes against him in post-war Kentucky, and that's where he ended up living in Cincinnati after the war, ran a business, and died shortly thereafter. So this duel to me is important because it was one of the last duels fought in Kentucky under the formal code duello. But again, there were a handful of other duels in the state. At that dueling ground I mentioned in Lexington in 1866, a former Union sergeant fought a duel with a former Confederate officer. They'd been antagonists since their boyhood. They were, hated one another in school. They'd gotten in a fist fight at a tavern in Paris and then fought this duel. And the former Confederate ended up wounding the former Union soldier. And then the Confederate ran off to exile and lived in Canada for 10 years until he was pardoned by a governor for dueling. So there were other duels that happened. And they were both those men had been, I had Chickamauga up here because both of them had been terribly wounded at Chickamauga. One had his arm mangled, the other had his leg shattered. So you have these two, terribly wounded Union veterans, both of whom had suffered terrible injuries during the war. The former Confederate, for example, had his head clipped at the Battle of Stones River by a cannonball. And they thought he was dead till he sat up in basically the wagon that was hauling off the dead bodies. And so, I mean, again, these men had gone through terrible turmoil, but this code of honor and this animosity drove them to the battleground drove them to the dueling ground rather after the war. So the duel between Casto and Metcalfe, it wasn't the last duel fought in Kentucky, but to me it represents an important turning point that shows how the application of violence really changed in the bluegrass state after the war. And so violence essentially became deregulated among the upper classes. No longer were challenges sent after the war. Instead, upper class Kentuckians carried concealed weapons, but they still had this sort of ego and honor culture. So if their honor was bruised, instead of sending a challenge note, they would pull pistols, would immediately start shooting on the street. So violence became, much more rapid, and the era of negotiations for violence was gone after the Civil War. Because again, it just seemed ridiculous to these men. After killing people on the battlefield, why would I waste my time with this negotiation? Also, there was a proliferation of firearms readily available after the war, so it was easy to get a pistol just to carry around in your pocket. My dad taught history at Washington Lee University in Lexington, Virginia for about 43 years. And he told me a story when I was working on this book. He said that he found an account of a Kentuckian who'd moved to Lexington, Virginia, and was going up to the courthouse to get some paperwork signed. And he saw two Virginians arguing in front of the courthouse. And as their voices raised, they became enraged. The Kentuckian actually dove in a bush because he figured they were going to pull pistols and shoot one another. However, he waited, and no gunfire happened, and he sat up, and the two men were shaking hands, and he was shocked. He was like, "This never would have happened in Kentucky. The two men simply would have shot each other." And with the decline of the duel, one Southerner lamented. He said, "But now the silver-mounted smoothbore dueling pistols have given way to the rifle-barreled revolvers, and quick snap shooting on the street has superseded the old-fashioned 10 paces. The formality of a challenge in duel is now out of fashion, and the hip pocket pistol is now inserted in every man's trousers. Both methods are barbarous, but I'm inclined to think that the old-time method was the least so, as it gave one time to make his will and hope for an apology." So some people lamented the end of this duel, but, there were a number of these fights that went on. Two Republican Party operators in Lexington, Kentucky, who hated one another, ended up encountering each other at the Lexington post office. Again, the men hated each other, but as luck would have it, one man's post office box was right on top of the other one, of course. One man was armed with a pistol, the other had a knife, and they killed each other. They embraced, one shooting, one stabbing, and both of them ended up dying. One of them was stabbed 13 times. The other man was shot in the stomach and eventually died. And so this sort of upper class violence became rather commonplace to see in Kentucky newspapers. And it's one of those things that really, sent Kentucky's reputation into a spiral. We were once the erudite home of Henry Clay, before the Civil War. After the war, the New York Times was running articles saying a day's accounting of violence in Kentucky, essentially a bulleted list all over the state of different killings, stabbings, bushwhackings, feuds, things that were going on. Again, by 1890, the reputation of the state was in tatters. And of course, when presumptive Governor William Goebel, violence caused a reputation to suffer. When William Goebel was assassinated at Kentucky's now old state capitol on that lawn, again, it was another reason for people out of state to see Kentucky as a feuding backwater. And that's eventually what happened to our reputation. And people political leaders in the state really saw this violence as being something that was harming the state's economic development too, because no one wanted to move into Kentucky when there was this terrible reputation that was going on. So in my latest book, Anatomy of a Duel, I really examined the secession crisis and really how violence changed in Kentucky through the lens of the Casto-Metcalfe duel. And again, for me, it's sort of a pivot point when dueling fell out of fashion, but Southern honor culture really remained alive in Kentucky for decades and decades and decades after the war, and ended up leaving this sort of hair-triggered violence. So, the book is really an accounting of violence during the 19th century, using the Casto-Metcalfe duel as the framework, for that study. But happy to be here and would be happy to answer any questions you might have. So thank you.
Stuart, thank you so much. That was really good. we do have time for questions, and I will pass the mic around or hand it to you so that the people who are tuning in virtually can hear as well, right here.
There. Yeah, so the question was how many bullets were in the Colt revolving rifle? They were actually, it was a 5-shot rifle, and they only loaded it with 1 round though. Yeah, so they only put 1 bullet in it actually. So only 1, because, again, like a typical dueling pistol, it would only have 1 round. And so they were sort of using that type of formality. They would be fully loaded in the battle, right? 5, yeah. But for pretense, and oh, we're keeping this fair and honorable. We're only going to load it with 1 shot. Yeah. Yes, sir. Who's got the mic back here? Or go ahead. You go ahead.
I've got 2 questions. If I can frame them correctly. The first one is, I think you covered this. Duels were illegal. However, if you fought one, could you be convicted of murder? You want to answer that one first?
I can. You could be, but courts rarely prosecuted duelists. And that's one reason, for example, a lot of the prominent dueling grounds, like the one in Lexington that I mentioned, or there's the dueling grounds racetrack down in Franklin County, Kentucky. It was either on county or state lines, so it was difficult to determine who had prosecutorial jurisdiction of the case. But prosecutors didn't want to touch it anyway, because in a lot of instances they said, "Oh, this makes sense. I know why they dueled. One man insulted the other. Of course they're going to duel." And what changed in Kentucky that I find really interesting is that sort of idea of dueling being acceptable then bleeds over in the courts to claims of self-defense really became the bulwark of murder cases in Kentucky. So if I shot Jim and Jim was found, sorry, Jim, I keep picking on you, but if I shot Jim on the street outside of the Filson in 1872 and he had a pistol on him, chances are a jury would have just let me go. In Jim's case, somebody would have said, well, he probably deserved it. But that happened too, actually. I mean, a lot of times people were like, oh, but one thing I do in this book is a lot of the people who were involved with the Casto Metcalfe affair, even if they were seconds, ended up having their own sort of post-Civil War violent encounters. Thomas Marshall Green, who was the lead negotiator for Colonel Metcalfe in the early stages of the duel, he ended up getting in a shootout on the streets of Lexington and killed his opponent. So, even all these people who were involved peripherally with the duel ended up, fighting, but none of these men, like this man, the second Thomas Marshall Green, was actually acquitted of murder.
Okay, quick.
Yeah.
Other than your honor, what would happen if you refused to participate in a duel?
Yeah, I mean, you could essentially be, shamed in your community was sort of the fear of it. You would just be seen as a lesser man, basically. But, not everyone agreed with dueling. I need to be clear about that. And so here at the Filson, one thing that I found, there's a list of men who sort of agreed to not duel. They signed this pledge. It's basically a big pledge, and they say, I will not engage in any affair of honor, blah, blah, blah. And all these people signed it. One of the men, George Trotter, who signed it, actually fought a duel later. But my favorite is the guy at the bottom who wrote, I will not duel except under very extreme circumstances. So, again, it was just seen as this, if you didn't defend yourself, you were seen as a lesser man. It could harm your business interest. Your in-laws could start shunning you. I mean, it's just that social pressure to do it was just there. But again, there was a fear. Not everyone went up to the dueling ground, full of vigor like Metcalfe did. There's one instance where 2 men exchanged shots, and 1 second went over to the other one and said, hey, how about if they just shake hands? Another second said, well, their hands have been shaking this past half hour. So my other favorite story is Cassius Marcellus Clay, the noted abolitionist and Bowie knife fighter. It was said he could sever a silver chain with a pistol at 10 steps. And during one duel, he kept missing. And somebody said, Cassius, why do you keep missing? He said, you can cut a silver chain. Why can't you shoot this guy? And he said, well, the damn chain never had a pistol in his hand. So again, there was this, fear of dying. I mean, it was a very serious business. And, some were much more loose than others. I mean, a lot of times they would exchange 1 shot and they'd be done. Like, okay, my honor's satisfied. But in other instances, again, people people died, as we know. So
Here's one from the chat. Was there ever a circumstance where a woman participated in a duel, perhaps in disguise or as a second?
the only stories I found in New Orleans, there were supposedly some duels between women. Those are the only accounts I found, and you can't tell if it's apocryphal or not. But I think there were none in Kentucky that I could find. But I think in New Orleans, which was sort of, there are a number of duels in New Orleans. I mean, newspaper editors in New Orleans, I don't know how they survive more than 20 minutes, basically. They're constantly dueling or getting shot on the street, unfortunately. But yeah, I've not found any other than a few newspaper accounts, but it was sort of beyond the scope of what I was working on in terms of this book, so I didn't delve too deeply into it.
Jim?
Did your research allow you to actually practice with these Civil War type era firearms?
I did not practice with any firearms, unfortunately. I should have, though. That's a good point. I should have run out and taken a few shots, but no. And I've shot, musket. I worked at Perryville for 10 years, so I've shot muskets before. But again, a wide variety of weapons were used in dueling. But pistols. There was John Wilson, who's the former governor of South Carolina, actually wrote a tract on dueling, and he said you should only use pistols. Anything else is barbarous. So, yeah, but I have not practiced.
Stu, I've got a question
Sure.
that relates to our mutual interest in the evolution of Kentucky violence.
Right.
The state had the reputation or had the record of the highest homicide rate in the nation, I think, for most of the period between the Civil War and World War I. Have you found indications that the more readily availability of military assault weapons of the Civil War era to civilians contributed to that?
Jim, what are you trying to do? You're trying to. I will not be discussing the AR-15 this evening, but I mean, I do think that that proliferation of guns after the war did not help, and that continued up into the 20s. As you know, one project I'm working on now that involves a murder in Lexington in the 20s. I mean, everybody went around armed during Prohibition too, and there was this fear. I think what happened was armed robberies went up. There were a lot of robberies, so people started carrying pistols because they were afraid of getting carjacked, essentially. And carrying concealed weapons was illegal, but the fines were so low that you get a $5 fine for carrying the pistol. But my grandfather grew up in Louisville, and this reminds me of a story my mom told me years ago that in probably the late 20s, early 30s, he was driving, and there was a man lying in the road that he thought had been hit by a car. So he gets out of his car to help the guy, and the guy jumped up to rob him, basically. And so these sort of carjackings in the 20s were unfortunately pretty common, which led to other people carrying pistols, and then more violence sort of erupted from that. So I've not found anything specifically on military style weapons, but I do think the number of weapons that did exist in Kentucky after the war, where you could go to practically any store and buy a Colt Army or Navy pistol, led to this. Did not help the rates of violence in Kentucky.
Hey, Stuart, so glad to be here tonight. I just finished coincidentally your book, Perryville Under Fire.
Oh, thanks.
And it's really nice to see you here personally today to make it a little more alive.
Well, thanks.
And thanks to the Filson. Again, I'm not a native, but I love what the Filson does to give opportunity to see all these things. I just recently went through poll worker training for the first time to work with the polls and had to stand with about 30 other people to take an oath, and it included not having been involved in a duel,
Right.
or being a second. And what is with that?
Yeah.
And why has that not changed?
I think they've kept that in. Again, it was part of the 1850 Constitution, and I think they've kept that in just because it's amusing, to be honest. Is sort of, but I guess it exists in the 1890 Constitution. They just never changed that. So, but again, they wanted to deter men who had political aspirations from fighting duels, and so that's why it was in there. Because if you did, Thomas Marshall Green, who I mentioned earlier, he had sent a challenge to another newspaper editor, and he'd been an attorney at the time, and he lost his law license as a result of that. So there are petitions you can see in governor's papers saying, hey, I'm writing to see if I can get my law license back. I issued a challenge to duel 10 years ago, but it was actually never fought. Things like that. So basically that oath is in there just to dissuade people from dueling. And now it's fun, and I hope they keep it in there, honestly. Makes it a little more interesting.
Yes.
Well, I think now, I don't think people consider us a violent state now. But I think, the question was, but I think at the time, people did see Kentucky as being a very violent place. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yes, so locally speaking, I believe that it was illegal to duel in Kentucky and
Right.
Louisville, and you would go across the river. I believe on a map I had seen in New Albany, there was a dueling ground.
I think so. I was talking to somebody about that earlier. Yeah.
Can you speak to the frequency of, I mean, it's obviously named that on a map,
Right.
you know?
I think, so the one in Lexington had about 5 known duels that were fought there. So typically at a dueling ground, it wasn't like there were 20, 30, 40 duels, but I think it became, like any place name, it just sort of sticks. Like the dueling ground in Franklin, Kentucky in Simpson County, where there's a track still called the dueling ground down there. I think a lot of these places just became, again, because that county lines are going over the county line. People were going to New Albany from Louisville to fight, but also in 1861, there were 2 Indiana legislators who were going to come to Kentucky and fight a duel with knives because they'd argued over the secession crisis. So there's a lot of this interstate travel, like Andrew Jackson, killed Dickinson and down in Simpson County. Sam Houston, when he was in Tennessee, fought a duel there. So to avoid prosecution, that's when they would end up jumping county or state lines. County lines was more frequent than state lines, just depending on where you lived. Like, is it VV Indiana or VVI? How do you pronounce it? Vive. I've heard it like it's been pronounced. I've heard it 50 different times, but VEVAY, however that's pronounced in Indiana. Like there were a couple of Kentuckians who ended up fighting a duel there. One of whom was Roger Hanson, who became a Confederate general, led the Orphan Brigade, got shot in the leg there while dueling a man who was marrying his cousin, and he was angry about that. So they dueled, and Hanson got capped in the leg. So they went across the Ohio River to avoid that prosecution. So,
Okay,
yeah. Yes, sir.
I would like to, first of all, say I'm still trying to get the image out of my head of Abe Lincoln chopping somebody in half with a broadsword.
Right.
You said that the man challenged Lincoln, so Lincoln picked the weapons.
Right.
Is that typical in a duel?
It was typical. Yeah, it was sort of the way is the code duello was practiced in most states. If you were challenged, you would pick the weapon and the time and the place too, because the idea was to give you that little bit of an advantage as a challenge party. There's one story I found, like a blacksmith got challenged to a duel, which I think again, this may just be a story, but he supposedly chose hammers to duel a guy with. So,
I'm gonna say, was there a history of any really outlandish weapons?
well, the craziest one I ever heard,
Pies in the face?
two men,
like that?
yeah, the craziest one I've heard was there was a man who was challenged to duel, and what they ended up doing was going to the doctor's office, and he would bleed them until one said, "I give up." And so they would just lie there with their vein draining until one said, "I've had enough." Which, again, you don't know if it's apocryphal or if it really happened, but that's sort of the craziest one that I encountered. I mean, it's all crazy, but yeah, lying there as your doctor is bleeding you is a little bit much. But those suicidal duels, like I mentioned, the shotguns on the wire or people who want to stand at incredibly close distances. There's another duel that used Colt revolving rifles. And I mentioned this in the book. I think it was in Alabama, and they stood, pretty far apart. And the idea was after they had emptied their weapon, they would then charge and fight each other with Bowie knives. But the second fire, one man killed the other and the duel ended. So they didn't actually charge each other at that time. So, rules vary, but it was typically pistols at 10 paces was the very typical weapon and distance. Also, historical flair was brought into it since we're here at the Filson. A lot of times they've used historic weapons. I mentioned the former Confederate, former Unionists who fought in Lexington. They actually used Henry Clay's dueling pistols in that fight. So I guess it brings a little bit of fanciness to killing each other, by using Clay's pistols. But
Well, I guess Henry Clay and Cassius Clay were both my second cousins, 5 times removed. So it's very distant. But here is the last question, and it's from the chat room. Does any other state have such a clause in their constitution or legal agreements about not dueling?
So dueling was illegal in most states. I think there were clauses in previous constitutions. I don't think any still have that oath that I've seen. I might be wrong on that, but I have not uncovered any other that still have that as part of the code. But you know, Missouri, had a lot of dueling before the war. I mean, all over the South, you know, there was dueling, so. But I haven't seen that. Yeah, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. Thanks, guys. Oh, thank you.